The black maid was caught sleeping in the mansion. The billionaire's reaction shocked everyone. The chandeliers glimmered above the marble floors, catching the light like frozen stars, and in that reflection Naomi moved quietly, carrying her bucket and cloth as though she were part of the architecture itself. Her footsteps never echoed. Her presence barely stirred the air. For the household staff she was reliable, always on time, never raising her voice, never forgetting a task. For Richard Hale, the billionaire who owned the house and everything within it, she was little more than a shifting silhouette in the periphery of his vision, a figure who kept the walls polished and the carpets free of dust. To Naomi, that invisibility had become survival. She began her mornings before dawn, arriving through the service entrance where the hum of industrial machines drowned out the silence of the sleeping mansion. The smell of lemon polish clung to her hands, and the starch of her uniform made her skin itch, yet she never complained. By the time the sun crept over the estate's stone facade, Naomi had already laid out the breakfast service, pressed the napkins, and ensured the silverware gleamed like mirrors. Her world existed in the gaps between the Hale family's movements. She stepped into rooms only after they had left, arranging pillows, refilling glasses, straightening curtains that no one ever noticed had shifted. On rare occasions, Richard Hale would glance in her direction, usually when asking where a set of papers had been placed or whether his suit had returned from pressing. She would answer softly, her words crisp but small, and he would nod without truly hearing. Naomi had become accustomed to that. She had long since stopped expecting gratitude or even acknowledgement. Her pride came not from recognition but from perfection, from the way a dining table could shine like a photograph in a magazine, or the way footsteps left no trace after she swept the grand staircase. Despite the elegance of her surroundings, Naomi's own life was marked by absence. She lived within the walls of opulence but owned nothing more than the clothes folded in a small satchel she kept tucked in a corner of the laundry. Her niece's school fees, her grandmother's medication, her sister's mounting debts consumed every paycheck. Naomi endured long hours because she believed it was her duty to hold her family together, even if it meant erasing herself in the process. When she carried trays of crystal glasses, she carried also the invisible weight of her family's survival. The other staff members sometimes whispered among themselves, their voices bouncing lightly against the tiled corridors, but Naomi rarely joined. She was polite, respectful, but kept her distance. While they exchanged stories of their weekends or shared laughter over a shared joke, Naomi moved steadily from one task to another, her hands busy, her eyes lowered. She told herself she could not afford distraction, yet in truth, she feared that if she spoke too much, someone might notice the fatigue that lined her face, or the sadness hidden beneath her composure. Richard Hale's mansion was more than just a place of work. It was a living museum of power, each corridor lined with art worth more than Naomi could ever imagine owning. She dusted the frames with careful hands, staring sometimes at the painted eyes that seemed to watch her. The contrast was stark. The house breathed wealth, but Naomi was like a shadow gliding across its surface. Every evening, as the family retired to their suites and the laughter of guests faded, Naomi remained in the background, adjusting cushions, extinguishing lamps, ensuring that the grandeur would be intact again by morning. In that silence, when the echo of footsteps disappeared and the marble floors cooled, Naomi allowed herself to breathe. The mansion, emptied of its owners, became her domain for a fleeting moment. Yet even then, she was cautious, moving quietly, folding her exhaustion into the rhythm of her duties. The halls knew her shape, but the man who owned them did not. To Richard, she was simply the maid, diligent and precise, a pair of unseen hands that made the chaos of his household vanish before it ever reached his eyes. What Naomi carried within her heart, no one asked. What she sacrificed, no one knew. She had become an expert at blending into silence, perfecting the art of erasure. In a house where every surface gleamed and every sound was measured, Naomi was the one presence that was always there yet never seen. When the last lights in the mansion flickered out and the great house settled into its nightly stillness, Naomi did not walk through the gate like the rest of the staff. She lingered in the quiet corridors until even the echoes of footsteps were gone. Then, with the careful movements of someone used to concealing herself, she descended into the depths of the service wing. Past the smell of detergent and the steady hum of the washing machines lay a narrow door that most people overlooked. Behind it was a storage space, little more than a cramped corner where brooms leaned against the wall and folded sheets were stacked in uneven towers. This was where Naomi lived after the world of the mansion slept. On the floor, she had laid a thin blanket, worn from years of use. It barely softened the hardness of the tiles beneath, but she had taught herself to rest on it without complaint. A spare pillow, hidden deep within a laundry basket, served as her only comfort. Every night she would carefully spread the blanket, curl her body to conserve warmth, and let the hum of machines fill the silence. To anyone else it would have seemed a place unfit for sleep, but to Naomi it was safety. Here, she was sheltered from the cold streets and from questions she could not afford to answer. Her secret refuge was not born from choice, but necessity. Each paycheck she received was gone before it ever truly belonged to her. A portion went straight to her grandmother's medications, prescriptions that kept her alive yet consumed more than half of Naomi's earnings. Another part covered her niece's school fees, which Naomi insisted on paying because she believed education was the only way to lift her family out of the cycle that had trapped them for generations. Whatever remained she sent to her sister, whose fragile health left her unable to work steadily. By the time Naomi accounted for them all, nothing remained for herself. Rent had become a luxury she could no longer justify. She had tried at first to keep a small room on the edge of the city, but the costs rose faster than her wages. The landlord demanded more each month, and the peeling walls gave no comfort. When the final demand came and she realized she could either pay him or keep her grandmother's medicine flowing, she chose family. With her belongings packed into a single satchel, she walked away without protest. That night, she returned to the mansion for her shift and never left. She slipped into the storage room once the house slept, lying still until dawn, then folded her blanket away before anyone discovered her. Naomi told herself it was temporary, that she would find another place soon, but weeks turned to months. The mansion became both her workplace and her shelter, though only one side of it was acknowledged. She existed in two worlds at once, the polished grandeur of the Hale estate by day and the shadows of the laundry by night. Every morning, she smoothed the blanket into its hiding place, brushed the lint from her uniform, and emerged as if nothing were unusual. There were nights when the cold bit through the thin fabric, when the dampness of the floor ached in her bones. She would curl tighter, hands clasped beneath her chin, and whisper prayers into the darkness that no one would ever find her like this. Discovery meant shame, perhaps dismissal, perhaps the end of the fragile stability she still clung to. But she bore it all in silence, the sacrifice written not in words, but in the quiet endurance of each day. To anyone looking in from the outside, Naomi appeared like every other servant, punctual, obedient, invisible. Yet behind closed doors, she lived in secrecy, carving a hidden life in a forgotten corner of wealth. The mansion that symbolized access to the world had become, in the smallest space within it, her only refuge. The night had been restless for Richard Hale. A dinner meeting had run long, and though his driver expected him to head to the penthouse across the city, Richard instructed him instead to take him back to the estate. He told himself it was to retrieve a forgotten folder, but in truth, the mansion's silence often soothed him in ways the chaos of his business life never could. It was well past midnight when the car pulled into the gravel drive, the lamps of the great house casting their pale glow against the frost-touched windows. Richard dismissed the driver and entered alone, his footsteps echoing through the grand foyer as if to remind him he was the sole master of this domain. The corridors were dim, the air carrying the faint scent of polished wood and soap. As he moved deeper inside, he noticed something unusual. A low hum still came from the laundry wing, as though the machines had been left running longer than they should have. Curious, he followed the sound, his polished shoes moving softly against the tiled floor. The hall was empty, but when he pushed open the narrow door to the storage space, his gaze fell on something he could not at first comprehend. There, curled up on the cold floor beneath a thin blanket, lay Naomi. Her uniform was still on, wrinkled from the day's work, her shoes set neatly beside her like a child afraid of misplacing them. The rise and fall of her breathing was shallow, her body drawn tight against the chill of the night. A folded pillow supported her head, its edges frayed from use. She looked impossibly small in the vastness of his mansion, reduced to a shadow hiding among brooms and buckets. Richard stood frozen at the threshold, confusion tightening his chest. At first, instinct told him it must have been some misunderstanding. Perhaps a maid taking a brief rest before finishing chores. Yet the details betrayed something far different. The way her blanket was laid out carefully, the pillow positioned just so, the satchel tucked close to her side as if it held all she possessed. This was not an accident. This was a life being lived in secret. He stepped closer, and the light from the corridor fell across her face. Naomi stirred faintly but did not wake, her lips slightly parted, a faint shiver passing through her body as she pulled the blanket higher without opening her eyes. Richard's breath caught. In all the years she had served under his roof, he had never once considered where she went after her duties ended. Now the truth lay before him, undeniable. She had been sleeping here, within his mansion, while he entertained guests above, sipping wine beneath crystal chandeliers. Shock rolled over him in a way he had not expected. Not the sharp indignation of trespass, but a heavy realization that this woman, whom he had barely noticed, had been surviving in silence beneath his wealth. He looked around the cramped space, the peeling paint, the scent of detergent, the cold tiles pressing against her body each night. The contrast to his own world of silk sheets and roaring fireplaces struck him with a force greater than any financial loss or failed deal. For a long moment, he could not move. His hand lingered on the doorframe, his mind racing yet oddly still. He felt shame creep in, unfamiliar and unwelcome, as he recognized how easily he had let someone fade into invisibility. Naomi had been there every morning, ensuring his suits were pressed, his meals served, his home immaculate. Yet he had never asked about her life. And now here she was, hidden in the very walls of his estate, asleep in a corner that should never have been her bed. Richard finally stepped back, the sound of his breath loud in the hush of the room. He did not wake her, not yet. Instead, he remained standing there, caught between the man he had always been and the one this moment demanded he become. For the first time in years, the mansion did not feel like a fortress of control and order. It felt fragile, haunted by the truth of a woman who had been living unseen in its shadows. The sound of his voice startled her awake. Naomi sat up quickly, clutching the thin blanket to her chest as her eyes adjusted to the glow spilling in from the hall. For a moment she looked like someone caught trespassing, fear flashing across her face. Richard stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway, his features carved with confusion and something heavier he could not quite name. He had expected excuses, perhaps even defiance, but what he saw in her eyes was nothing of the sort. It was exhaustion, layered over with a quiet dignity that seemed untouched by her circumstances. "Naomi," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain. "What are you doing here?" She did not answer right away. Her fingers twisted the edge of the blanket, her gaze dropping to the floor as though words themselves might betray her. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I sleep here, sir." The simple admission pierced the silence with a weight far greater than any elaborate confession could have carried. Richard felt the question rise in his throat again, sharper this time, but he swallowed it back. Instead, he stepped inside, his eyes tracing the small details of her makeshift bed. The satchel pushed neatly against the wall, the pillow flattened from many nights of use. None of this looked like a temporary mistake. This was a life carved into secrecy. He forced himself to look at her again. "Why?" he asked, though even as the word left him, he feared the answer. Naomi's lips trembled as she tried to find the right way to tell him. "I send everything home," she said finally. "My grandmother's medicine, my niece's schooling, rent for my sister. There's nothing left for me." She lifted her chin slightly, as though bracing herself for judgment. It was easier to hide here than to lose them. Her words landed like stones in Richard's chest. He had built an empire on calculations and efficiency, on the ability to see through any negotiation. Yet here was a truth he had never thought to look for. He thought of the countless mornings he had seen her polishing silver or carrying trays, never once considering the hours beyond her service. She had moved like clockwork through his home, and he had accepted her presence as though it required no thought at all. Now, with each word she spoke, the image of his perfectly ordered world cracked. He pressed his hand against the doorframe, struggling to keep his composure. "All this time," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The marble floors, the paintings, the chandeliers, all the trappings of success that had seemed so permanent now felt hollow, as though they existed only to amplify how blind he had been. He looked at Naomi again, sitting small on the cold tiles, and for the first time in years he felt stripped of authority. Naomi did not beg for pity. She spoke with a quiet steadiness, explaining how each paycheck disappeared before it ever belonged to her. How the rising rents had forced her from her apartment, how she had learned to fold herself into the silence of the mansion's unused rooms. Her tone carried no bitterness, only resignation, as though this life had become the only one she knew how to endure. Richard listened, his throat tight, his thoughts unraveling. He had always measured his worth by the height of his towers, the weight of his investments, the power his name commanded in boardrooms. Yet here, in the dim laundry room of his own estate, all of it seemed paper-thin. What good was power if it left him blind to suffering under his very roof? What meaning did wealth hold if it created a palace that allowed someone like Naomi to disappear within its walls? The shame came not from her confession, but from the realization of how little he had cared to notice. He had thought himself a man who saw everything, who could read markets and men alike. Yet he had missed the story unfolding in front of him, a story of quiet sacrifice and survival. His empire, so carefully constructed, suddenly felt like a fragile mask hiding an emptiness he had never dared to face. And in that moment, as Naomi lowered her eyes and pulled the blanket closer, Richard knew the silence between them was heavier than any words he could summon. Richard remained in the narrow room long after Naomi's voice had fallen silent. The air seemed thicker than before, the hum of the washing machines echoing like a reminder of everything he had failed to see. He sat down on the edge of a wooden crate, his tailored suit crumpling against the rough surface, yet he hardly noticed. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about meetings, mergers, or the restless climb toward profit. He was thinking about the woman before him, the one who had polished his silver with aching hands, who had stood in silence as guests laughed and music filled his ballroom, who had never once asked for anything, while quietly carrying the weight of her family's survival. As he looked at her, fragments of memory surfaced. He remembered mornings when Naomi's eyes looked rimmed with red as she laid out his breakfast tray. He remembered how she sometimes moved slower in the afternoons, pausing to lean her weight against the edge of a table before straightening quickly if she thought anyone might notice. He recalled a winter evening when her uniform looked damp around the cuffs, as though she had walked through rain, yet she had still presented his dinner as though nothing were amiss. Each detail came back to him with startling clarity, details he had once dismissed as irrelevant. Now he realized they had been quiet signals of a life unraveling just beyond his view. Richard's mind circled around the truth Naomi had confessed, that her wages had vanished into medicine and tuition, and debts she did not owe but shouldered anyway. He thought of the contracts he signed daily, numbers that shifted in the millions, and how insignificant those sums seemed compared to the few $100s that determined whether her grandmother lived comfortably or whether her niece could continue in school. He felt the hollowness of his wealth press against him, all the empty rooms in his mansion, all the possessions stored away without use, while Naomi had been sleeping on the cold floor of his laundry room to keep her family alive. The longer he sat there, the less he could reconcile the man he believed himself to be with the man who had allowed this to happen. He had taken pride in being decisive, untouchable, efficient, but beneath that pride lay neglect. What he once called discipline now felt like blindness. What he once believed was strength now appeared brittle. Naomi had shown more endurance in silence than he had ever shown in conquest. Her resilience, born not from ambition but from necessity, stripped away the armor he had built around himself. Compassion rose in him slowly, unfamiliar but undeniable. He looked at her not as a servant but as a person whose loyalty had cost her nearly everything. He thought of how easily he could have dismissed her story if not for stumbling into this hidden corner of the house. The idea unsettled him more than he cared to admit. If he had not come home that night, she might have continued like this indefinitely, unseen and unacknowledged, until exhaustion or despair consumed her entirely. That thought gnawed at him, more bitter than any failure in business could have been. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as though waiting for judgment. Richard felt the urge to speak, to fill the silence, but no words seemed sufficient. Instead, he found himself studying her face, the fine lines of fatigue etched into her skin, the strength in the way she held herself despite it all. He realized then that she had been teaching him something for years without saying a single word. She had been teaching him the cost of indifference, the power of sacrifice, the quiet courage it took to keep showing up when the world refused to see you. In that moment, something in Richard's cold exterior cracked. The mansion no longer looked like a monument to triumph, but a cage that had kept him insulated from reality. Naomi's story had broken through its walls. He felt the first stirrings of an awakening, a recognition that his wealth and power meant little if they blinded him to the people standing right in front of him. He had always believed that success was measured by towers built and empires expanded. Now he began to understand that true measure might be found in whether he could finally open his eyes to someone who had lived in his shadow for far too long. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, painting the marble floors in soft gold. Richard had not slept. He had spent the hours pacing his study, replaying Naomi's words and the sight of her curled up in the laundry room. For the first time in years, he felt a pressing urgency that had nothing to do with markets or contracts. It was not the drive to win, but the need to correct a wrong that had been allowed to grow in the very heart of his home. By the time dawn broke, his decision was set. Naomi would not return to the laundry room floor. He summoned a physician before she even rose from her makeshift bed. The doctor arrived discreetly through the service entrance, carrying a black bag, and examined Naomi with gentle efficiency. She tried to protest, insisting she was fine, but Richard silenced her softly. He told her she had given enough of herself in silence, and now it was his turn to act. The doctor confirmed what Richard already feared. She was underweight, her blood pressure low, her body showing the strain of months without proper rest. It shook him to hear it spoken aloud, the evidence of neglect spelled out in clinical terms. By evening, arrangements had been made. Naomi was moved into a guest suite on the east wing of the mansion, a space that had stood empty for years while she had been sleeping on cold tiles. The room glowed with warm lamplight and smelled faintly of fresh linens. When she entered, Naomi stood frozen at the doorway, her eyes wide as though she could not quite believe the space was meant for her. Richard did not push her to speak. He simply told her the room was hers now. No conditions, no hidden expectations. His efforts did not stop with her. Within a week, her grandmother and niece were brought to the city, their modest apartment arranged under Richard's name so that the rent would never again hang over them like a threat. The medications were placed on automatic delivery. School fees were covered in advance for years. Naomi watched these changes unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as though afraid the kindness might dissolve if she looked too closely. Richard noticed the way her shoulders slowly began to loosen, how her eyes carried less of the constant strain. He saw, too, how difficult it was for her to accept help after years of carrying burdens alone. Richard knew that shelter and medicine were not enough. He wanted her to stand in his household, not as a shadow, but as a presence with dignity. Quietly, he drafted a new position, one that placed her in charge of staff and welfare across the estate. It was a role that demanded leadership, oversight, and trust, not servitude. When he presented the idea to her, Naomi's first reaction was silence. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery or hidden motives. Finding none, she asked in a soft voice why he would trust her with so much. Richard met her gaze and replied simply that no one else had ever proven more trustworthy. The title was formalized within days, her salary doubled, benefits secured. For the first time in her life, Naomi held authority within the walls that had once reduced her to invisibility. She began meeting with staff, listening to their concerns, arranging support for those who struggled quietly as she once had. Richard watched her grow into the role, her quiet composure now carrying a weight of command that inspired respect rather than indifference. The mansion itself began to change. Where once its beauty had seemed sterile, it now carried the hum of something more human. Richard noticed the difference in himself as well. The house that had once been a fortress of isolation became a place where he began to see not only surfaces but the people who moved among them. The transformation was not only Naomi's, it was his as well, a reordering of values he had never thought to question until that night in the laundry room. What had begun as shame was becoming something sturdier, a new foundation built not on wealth but on the act of finally seeing another person fully. The mansion's ballroom glittered with light, every chandelier ablaze, every surface polished to perfection. Guests in gowns and tuxedos filled the space with the hum of conversation, their laughter echoing under the vaulted ceiling. For years, Richard Hale had hosted evenings like this, events where power and wealth mingled behind crystal glasses, where his name was spoken with admiration or envy depending on who uttered it. Yet tonight felt different. The air held a weight he had never noticed before, as though something more important than business or status was about to take place. He stood at the edge of the stage, waiting for the murmur of the crowd to fade, a glass of water in his hand instead of champagne. When the music quieted and the lights dimmed slightly, Richard stepped forward. The room stilled. His presence commanded attention by habit, but his voice, when it came, carried none of the polished detachment his guests were used to hearing. He spoke slowly, his words carrying a rawness that silenced even the most cynical ears. He told them that for too long he had measured his worth by buildings and numbers, by the reach of his empire and the scale of his wealth. Then he admitted, with a calm that bordered on confession, that all of it had been hollow until a woman he had overlooked forced him to open his eyes. The audience shifted uneasily, unused to hearing vulnerability from a man like Richard. He continued anyway. He described Naomi without embellishment, recalling how she had served tirelessly in silence, how her sacrifices had gone unnoticed, how her strength had lived in the shadows of his mansion. His voice trembled only once, when he admitted that he had nearly lost her before he realized she was there at all. He did not dress it in grandeur or excuse. He told the truth, plain and piercing. Then he gestured to the side of the room where Naomi stood. She wore a simple dress of deep navy, her hair braided neatly back, her posture steady, though her eyes flickered with disbelief at being called forward. The crowd turned, some clapping politely at first, others hesitating, uncertain how to respond. Richard extended his hand to her, and after a brief pause, she stepped onto the stage. The applause grew louder, genuine now, as the weight of her story began to sink into those who had gathered only to celebrate themselves. Naomi did not speak, but she did not need to. The sight of her standing beside Richard was enough to shift the air. Here was a woman who had once been invisible, now recognized openly, not as a servant but as a figure of resilience and quiet strength. She kept her chin high, though her eyes glistened under the bright lights. For the first time, the mansion's grandeur seemed to bend toward her rather than away. Richard turned to the audience again. He declared that his true redemption was not found in contracts or wealth, but in the simple act of seeing someone he had ignored for far too long. He promised that his estate, his businesses, and his name would from now on be measured not by profits but by the lives he chose to uplift. The words might have sounded performative in another man's mouth, but here, spoken with sincerity carved from guilt and transformation, they carried weight. The applause that followed was unlike any Richard had heard in his lifetime. It was not admiration for wealth or envy of success. It was respect, tinged with awe, directed as much toward Naomi as toward the man who had finally learned to honor her. People rose to their feet, and for a brief moment the world within that glittering ballroom shifted. The woman who had once slept unseen on a laundry room floor stood in recognition, and the man who had built an empire discovered that his greatest legacy would be the humanity he had almost forgotten to see. In that moment, beneath the chandeliers and the eyes of the powerful, both of them stood redeemed. The music swelled again as Richard and Naomi stepped down from the stage, but the applause lingered like an echo that would not fade. The guests returned to their conversations, yet the atmosphere had changed. People looked at Naomi with a kind of reverence, not pity, and at Richard with surprise, as though they had glimpsed a man they had never truly known. The night carried on, but for the two of them it had already ended with a truth that would not be forgotten. Because the maid no one had seen now stood in the light of recognition, and the billionaire who once measured life by fortune discovered redemption not in wealth, but in finally seeing the humanity that had been beside him all along. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep watching.